Well, welcome to part 2 of chapter 9.
This is a tree of South Carolina ancestors, both English and Scots-Irish, who settled or were born in the Abbeville district of South Carolina. They all come out of my mother's side of the tree through the Mann and the Presley branches of our tree. All Scotch-Irish ancestors and their descendants who lived in Abbeville district are highlighted in the orange boxes. The ones who were born in Abbeville are also marked with magenta boxes. We only have one English Abbeville ancestor, Samuel Mann, shown in the blue box at the upper left-hand tree. We have more Scotch-Irish ancestors in our Mann tree shown in the lower half of the page. And we have more Scottish ancestors shown in the lower left side who have come out of the Presley branch of our tree. 17 of our ancestors in the yellow boxes or blue boxes moved to Abbeville, and 8 ancestors in the magenta boxes were born in Abbeville. There are 25 ancestors who immigrated to Abbeville or were born in Abbeville, South Carolina from 1750 to 1790. They're shown in tabular form on this table. The red lines separate the family groups. The concentration of 25 ancestors in Abbeville is like the concentration of English Puritan ancestors who settled in Groton, Massachusetts, which we discussed earlier. We have an ancestors living in Abbeville over a 64-year period from 1756 to about 1820. Descendants of all these ancestors settled in southern Illinois in the early part of the 1800s. The table lists the 25 ancestors who immigrated to Abbeville or were born in Abbeville, South Carolina from the 1750s to the 1790s. However, the Abbeville district wasn't created until 1785. So where did these earlier ancestors settle? The map on the left shows South Carolina districts in 1770. The settled areas are shown in yellow, and the wilderness areas are shown in blue. For our ancestors who came in the 1750s and 1760s, the areas where they settled were called the 96 district, shown in the red oval on the map on the left. They were some of the original European settlers of this area of South Carolina. The map on the right shows South Carolina in 1790 after the 96 district was subdivided, and the Abbeville district, shown in the red oval, was formed in 1785. You can see by this time the area was fully settled, and this is where our South Carolina ancestors' records ended up. The town of Abbeville became the county seat in 1765. Abbeville County, South Carolina, sits along the Savannah River, separating South Carolina and Georgia. The Abbeville district stretches from the Savannah River to the Saluda River, as shown on the right-hand map. Notice the black and white population of the Abbeville district in 1785 in the blue box. The black are 1665, the white are 9,197. As was the case in most of the back country, the slaves in the back country, this population was much less than it was along the coast. Here only 15% of the population were slaves, whereas near the coast more than 50% of the population were slaves. Our Scotch-Irish who settled the Abbeville district sailed from Ulster directly to Charleston, South Carolina. Scotch-Irish, French Huguenots, German farmers began settling the Abbeville area in the 1750s and 1760s. So how did they get from Charleston to Abbeville? In 1716, Fort Moore was completed at the site of the Indian village that was an important fur trading center. The 44-mile-long Fort Moore-Charleston Trail opened at this time. Our early settlers would arrive in Abbeville district by way of the Fort Moore-Charleston Trail, dashed blue line, and the Augusta-Cherokee Trail, green line. Some of our early ancestors along Long Cane Creek were killed by the Cherokee Indians in the 1760 Cherokee War. As a result, the British military constructed Fort Charlotte between 1765 and 1767 to help protect the local colonists from the hostile Indians. Fort Charlotte was built at the nexus of several trails along the Savannah River in South Carolina and Georgia. Only after the Fort Charleston was started in 1765 would travelers have been able to use the Fort Charleston, the Charleston and Fort Charlotte Trail, the red one. You can see the Fort Charlotte is very close to the area which became Abbeville. The trip was about 180 miles long and took about 10 days. This is the original man tree I've been presenting since chapter 4. 8th great-grandfather Thomas Mann I and 8th great-grandmother Elizabeth Booth immigrated from England to the Isle of Wight in Virginia. 7th great-grandfather Thomas Mann II and 7th great-grandmother Bridget Hooker, who moved from Virginia to Bertie County North Carolina. Sixth great-grandfather Thomas Mann III and Elizabeth Denton lived their entire lives in North Carolina. Fifth great-grandfather Samuel Mann was born in Bertie, North Carolina in 1715, and he married Margaret Crawford in Edgecombe, North Carolina in 1759. Fifth great-grandmother Martha Crawford was the daughter of sixth great-grandfather Gilbert Crawford and sixth great-grandmother Margaret Merrill, who were born in Augusta, Virginia, and were of Scotch-Irish descent. Samuel and Margaret moved to Abbeville in 1770, and fourth great-grandfather Robert Mann was born in Abbeville in 1771. He married fourth great-grandmother Mary Houston there in 1795, and third great-grandfather William Mann was born there in 1798. The purpose of this tree is to introduce the Beatty line and to illustrate the ethnicity of the people in the Mann's branch of our tree. I will be color-coding the tree to indicate the ancestor's ethnic background. The ones in blue will be English, the ones in orange will be Scottish, and the ones in the red boxes will be part English and part Scottish. I've already talked about the Manns and the Houstons. The Scotch-Irish Beattys arrived in South Carolina starting in 1760. Fifth great-grandfather John Beatty, Sr. was born in County Down, Northern Ireland about 1740. I have not been able to determine his wife's name. John died in Abbeville, South Carolina in 1824. John Jr., fourth great-grandfather John Jr., was born in County Down, Northern Ireland in 1758. He married fourth great-grandmother Jane Cochrane in Abbeville in 1785. Mary was the daughter of fifth great-grandfather Andrew Cochrane, who was born in Northern Ireland in 1749. Andrew came to Abbeville, South Carolina before 1766. He married fifth great-grandmother Sarah Baird in Abbeville in 1766. Sarah was born in Virginia and moved to Abbeville before 1766. Third great-grandmother Mary Jane Beatty was born in Abbeville in 1798. John Beatty Jr. moved with his family to what later became Randolph County, Illinois in 1809, and he was among the first settlers in southern Illinois, which I'll talk more about later. Mary Jane married third great-grandfather William Mann in Randolph County, Illinois in 1820. John Beatty Jr. died in Randolph County the same year his father died in Abbeville. I'll talk about Scotch-Irish Presleys later, but Jane Presley was also Scotch-Irish. So you can see using the original Mann tree that Robert Morrill Mann was about 50% Scotch-Irish. William Mann was 75% Scotch-Irish, and Robert Clinton Mann was 87% Scotch-Irish.
Who was fourth great-grandfather Robert Morrill Mann's father? Remember in Chapter 1, I said that ancestry research is not an exact science, and you must keep your mind open to new information when it becomes available. Now I found two conflicting answers to that question, which I'll explain in the tree on this chart and on the next one. Recently, I received a message from a lady named Susan Seabrook, who informed me that she had DNA proof that fourth great-grandfather Robert Morrill Mann was adopted and his real father was a Scotch-Irishman named John Lockwood. Susan told me that Y-DNA from a male descendant of Robert Mann showed that he was not the son of Samuel Mann, but was adopted by John Lockwood. However, she provided me with no documentation. I investigated the possibility. A John Lockwood did live in Abbeville at the time of Robert's birth. I found fourth and fifth cousins who share some very small amount of DNA with the Lockwoods. So somehow there is some connection there somewhere. I extended the Lockwood tree back 2 more generations, showing that John Lockwood's father and grandparents were also Scotch-Irish. I was able to determine earlier that Mary Houston, John Houston, and Alice Armstrong were also Scotch-Irish. However, everyone in this tree now is Scotch-Irish with the possible exception of Robert Mann or Lockwood's mother. Since everyone else in the tree is Scotch-Irish, it's very likely that she was too. You can see that this makes Robert Mann Lockwood 100% Scotch-Irish instead of 50% Scotch-Irish as shown in the original Mann tree. However, I found another Y-DNA record posted on Ancestry. This Y-DNA record links second great-grandfather Robert Clinton Mann to seventh great-grandfather Thomas Mann II, which provides a Y-DNA connection from second great-grandfather Robert Clinton Mann to seventh great-grandfather Thomas Mann II, which goes right through fourth great-grandfather Robert Morrill Mann. After I questioned Susan about this and asked if we could discuss it more by phone, she quit answering my emails. So I really don't know what's going on with her. I doubt if I will ever be able to fully resolve this. I would need to find a man-male, not a male-man, ancestor who would take the Y-DNA test to repeat the results that either Susan or Ancestry.com results and see if they were correct. But there are no living males in our branch of the tree. So I'm going to stick for the original version for now, but you might want to check it out sometime more in the future. What were our Scots-Irish ancestors' lives like in Scotland? I've been somewhat frustrated because I had not been able to trace many of our Scotch-Irish ancestors back beyond their time in Northern Ireland, or learn much about their lives in Scotland or their motivations to immigrate to Northern Ireland. Earlier in this chapter, I talked about the Eustons and the Armstrongs. Like most of our Scotch-Irish ancestors, the trail ended with sixth great-grandfather Robert Armstrong and sixth great-grandmother Alice Calhoun in Northern Ireland. When I started to dig deeper into Robert Armstrong's and Alice Calhoun's Scottish backgrounds, I found that both her ancestors came from prominent Scottish clans that were well documented. With these new references, I could reliably trace their ancestors back for many more generations and get answers to my questions. Tracing these ancestors and learning of their experiences in the Scottish clans gave me a better understanding of their lives and why they exhibited the characteristics that I described earlier in this chapter. But this is also what made this chapter get so long, but hopefully it will also make it more interesting to you. I'll start with the Calhouns because I can trace them back further than I can the Armstrongs. But first, a few preliminaries. In my research of our Scottish ancestors, I found that some of them were members of Scottish clans. So what is a Scottish clan? Early Scottish societies were primarily organized by clans, not by political boundaries, somewhat like Native American Indian tribes. In Scottish society at the time of our clans lived there, a clan loyalty was much stronger than national loyalty. The laird was the owner of a large estate, usually with a castle where the clan lived. Most of the followers of the clans were tenants on the laird's lands who supplied labor to the clan leaders to grow their crops or fight in the battles against the clans or sometimes even the kings. The clan chief is the head of the clan and carries the authority and responsibility for the welfare and the governance of the clan members. In many ancient clans, the chief and the laird were the same person. It's a common misconception that every person who bears the clan's name is a lineal descendant of the clan's chief. Many clansmen, although not related to the chief, took the chief's surname because as their own to show allegiance to the clan and to obtain basic protection and support from the clan. Clans had coats of arms, family crests to distinguish them from other clans, and most clans had their own tartan patterns, which the clan members incorporated into their kilts and other clothing. What clans were our ancestors associated with, and where were they located? The map on the left divides Scotland into highlands in medium green and the lowlands in light green. The map shows the location of the major clans in Scotland. The map on the right is the blow-up of the regions where our ancestors' clans lived, and it will be highlighted with red ovals. The Qualiquin clan, later called the Calhoun clan, is located on the border between the highlands and lowlands of Scotland. The Armstrong clan, is located along the border between Scotland and England. Clans are generally identified with geographical areas originally controlled by their founders, usually with an ancestral castle. I'll start with the Qualiquin clan. Our Qualiquin clan ancestors changed their name to Calhoun when they immigrated to Northern Ireland. But before getting into their stories, I have some symbols to define. On the upper left is the Qualiquin clan family crest. The upper left center is the Qualiquin family coat of arms. The main difference between the crest and the coat of arms is that the crest symbolizes the clan's origin in some way, and the coat of arms is a decoration the clan warriors often wore on their shields or flags to identify their fellow clan members during battles, usually containing symbols taken from the family crest. The upper center right are the tartan colors. I will be tracing the movement of our Scottish ancestors from Dunbartonshire, Scotland to Northern Ireland and then on to the American British colonies. I will use the icon in the upper far right to identify people who lived their whole lives in Dunbartonshire, Scotland. This is the Dunbartonshire, Scotland coat of arms. I will use the crossed Scottish and Northern Ireland flags at the bottom left to identify people who immigrated from Scotland to Northern Ireland, and I will use the Northern Ireland flag for people who lived their whole life in Northern Ireland. I will continue to use the crossed-hatched Scottish and Irish flags for people who became Scots-Irish by immigrating to America. Even though most of our ancestors arrived in America before the Revolution, I will use the American flag for people who lived their entire lives in America. This is the story of how the Colquhoun clan got the family crest. The chief of the Colquhoun clan was given a command by the king to seize the well-fortified Dumbarton Castle. The chief wrote back in French, the accepted language of the time, "Si je puis, if I can." The chief gathered a group of his men and hid them in the woods outside the Dumbarton Castle gates. Then they initiated a siege of the castle. After several days, they lured a red stag by the gates of the castle, chased by 2 greyhounds. When the starving garrison in the castle opened the gates to chase the stag, the chief's clansmen rushed into the castle and captured it for the king. The chief in this story could have been our 24th great-grandfather, Sir Euphrates de Kilpatrick, who was the first to take the Colquhoun name. My luck at finding valuable reference information is holding up. There's a wealth of information about the Colquhoun clan online and in books like the one shown here. These 2 books, Chiefs of the Colquhoun and Their Country, Volumes 1 and 2 by William Fraser, are full of information that I used in this presentation. These books trace the Colquhoun family back to 1150 with complete family trees and biological information about each generation. This book, The Calhoun Family of South Carolina, picks up where the others left off. It's a very good reference for our Calhouns in South Carolina. There's a wealth of information there's also a wealth of information then about on the web, and the links to just a few of them are shown on the left side of this chart. With all this new documentation, I was able to reliably extend the Calhoun branch of our tree out for 28 generations. This is the complete Calhoun or Colquhoun pedigree tree. I've used yellow dashed lines to divide the tree into sections based on where they lived. The 14th through the 28th generation of Colquhoun's clan lived on their clan lands in Dunbartonshire, Scotland. The 13th generation immigrated to Northern Ireland, and the 10th through the 12th generations lived in Northern Ireland. The 9th generation immigrated to America, and the 1st through the 8th generations lived their whole lives in America. I don't expect you can read this, so I'll break it down into larger pieces below when I talk about some of these ancestors. You will be relieved to know that I will not be talking about all of the ancestors in this tree. Our first Colquhoun ancestor was born almost 900 years ago in Dunbartonshire, Scotland. I find it difficult to imagine how long ago that was. It helped me put this into perspective by creating a timeline of what was going on in the world when these different generations of Colquhouns were alive. I'll start with our 6th great-grandmother, Alice Calhoun, who arrived in America in 1735. 8th great-grandfather, William Colquhoun, was alive when Scotland officially became part of Great Britain. 11th great-grandfather, Alexander Colquhoun, lived in Dunbartonshire, Scotland, when our first English ancestors arrived in Jamestown. When Henry VIII started the English Protestant Reformation, 12th great-grandfather John Colquhoun lived in Dunbartonshire, Scotland. 14th great-grandfather John Colquhoun was alive when Ferdinand Magellan and his crew sailed around the world. When Columbus sailed to America, 15th great-grandfather Humphrey Colquhoun lived in Scotland. And 17th great-grandfather John Colquhoun was alive when the Gutenberg printing press was invented. When Joan of Arc was burned at the stake, Sir Malcolm Colquhoun lived in Dunbartonshire, Scotland. When 20th great-grandfather Robert Colquhoun was alive, the construction of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris was completed. Robert de Bruce was King of Scotland when 21st great-grandfather Humphrey Colquhoun lived there. Marco Polo traveled the Silk Road during 22nd great-grandfather Ingilramus de Colquhoun's lifetime. Genghis Khan established the Mongol Empire while 24th great-grandfather Sir Euphrates de Colquhoun was alive. And the Second Crusade occurred during the 25th great-grandfather Gilbert Kilpatrick's lifetime. Well, who were the Scottish monarchs? In the previous chapters, I introduced all the English kings and queens who made decisions that affected our English ancestors. In order to speed things up, I've decided not to do that for all the Scottish monarchs. However, you're going to hear about several of the early Scottish monarchs, so I provided a list for a reference. I've added pictures of the ones who directly affected our ancestors, who were members of Scottish clans. Also, the ones in the red box were monarchs of both Great Britain and Scotland before Scotland became part of Great Britain. The Colquhouns got their name from an area of Scotland called Colquhoun that was granted to the first Colquhoun laird around 1200. The map on the left shows the Colquhoun lands between Loch Lomond and the Firth of Clyde. These boundaries change over time, but the area outlined in the red oval is my best guess as to the extent of the Colquhoun lands when our ancestors lived there. Dumbarton is the main town in Dumbartonshire on the Firth of Clyde. The entire area is referred to as Dumbartonshire. The map on the right is a modern map of Scotland, and I've marked Glasgow and Edinburgh, as well as the clan lands of Loch Lomond, the Firth of Clyde, and Dumbarton. A firth is a Scottish word for an inlet to the sea, what we would call a sound, like the Albemarle Sound in North Carolina. A loch is a Scottish word for lake. Our first 14 generations of Colquhouns lived in Dumbartonshire, Scotland. Dungas Castle, which is perched on a rocky cliff overlooking River Clyde, which flows out of the southeast edge of the Firth of Clyde. It was built in 1380 and served as the headquarters and defensive stronghold for the Colquhoun clan. The drawing on the left shows the castle in the 1400s, and the picture on the right shows what remains of it today. I'll start the tree at the end and move forward in time. 25th great-grandfather Gilbert Kilpatrick was born in Dumbartonshire, Scotland, around 1150. He married Annabel Kilpatrick there sometime before 1190. Sir Gilbert died at the age of 70 in 1220. 24th great-grandfather Sir Umphredes de Kilpatrick was born in 1190 in Dumbartonshire. Sir Umphredes obtained the charter for his services as a knight for the lands of Colquhoun around 1215 from King Alexander II. According to the custom of the time, Sir Umphredes dropped his name Kilpatrick and took the name Umphredes de Colquhoun. He married 24th great-grandmother Isabel Kilpatrick there at an unknown time. 23rd great-father Robert de Colquhoun was born in 1220 and took over the estate when his father died. Now I'm skipping forward to 20th great-grandfather Robert de Colquhoun, who was born in 1328. 20th great-grandfather Sir Robert de Colquhoun married Lady Luss, heiress of the Luss family. As a result, the Luss lands were merged with the Colquhoun lands. The map shows the Luss lands located next to the Colquhoun lands. Now I'm skipping to 18th great-grandfather John Colquhoun, who was born in Dumbartonshire in 1370. He married 18th great-grandmother Jean Erskine there sometime before 1398. Sir John was appointed governor of Dumbarton Castle by King James I of Scotland in 1427. You can read more about this historic castle in the references below the castle picture. He was also a patron of the Church of Luss. He was a member of Parliament in 1437 during the reign of King James II. Sir John was lured into an ambush by the MacLean clan at the Emerson Castle in Loch Lomond in 1439 and was killed along with 120 of his men. This is a picture of the ruins of the Emerson Castle, and the castle was later used as a hunting lodge by King James IV and King James VI. Now I'm jumping to 16th great-grandfather Sir John Colquhoun. 16th great-grandfather Sir John Colquhoun was born in 1420 in Luss, Dumbartonshire, Scotland. He married Elizabeth Dunbar there before 1443. He inherited his father's titles and estates. He held the office of Comptroller of the Royal Household of Scotland between 1464 and 1466. In 1471, he served as Sheriff of Dumbartonshire, and in 1474 as Lord Chamberlain of Scotland. He collected the revenues for the Crown. He had jurisdiction for judging all crimes committed within his borough. In 1477, he was named Keeper of Dumbarton Castle by King James IV. The castle was attacked on May 1st of 1478 by John Stuart, the first Earl of Lennox, who was fighting King James the Fourth's army at the time. The castle was successfully defended, but Sir John was killed by a cannonball during the siege of the castle. Another interesting ancestor in this section of the tree is the 11th great-grandfather, Chief Alexander Colquhoun. He was born in 1573 in the Luss, Dunbartonshire, Scotland. In 1603, during his time as chief of the Colquhouns, a feud broke out between the Colquhouns and the MacGregors. The MacGregor clan had been carrying out raids in the Colquhoun lands for some time. The MacGregors had mistaken Sir Humphrey Colquhoun for his brother, Chief Alexander Colquhoun, and murdered Humphrey. Chief Alexander was looking for revenge. Two members of the MacGregor clan were traveling through Colquhoun territory and stopped at a farmhouse in the Colquhoun clan lands for food and shelter, but were turned away. They killed a sheep and offered to pay for it, but were seized and carried before Chief Alexander, who instantly ordered them executed. Well, this initiated the Battle of Glenfruin. The MacGregor clan's lands were just across the northeast of the Colquhoun lands, across Lake Lomond. To avenge the deaths of the two MacGregors, Chief Alistair MacGregor assembled a force of about 400 men and marched towards Luss. Chief Alexander Colquhoun hastily mustered his forces to defend his lands. The MacGregors and the Colquhouns met at Glenfruin, a short distance from Luss, on February 7, 1603. The stone monument on the left marks the site of the Battle of Glenfruin. After a fierce battle, the Colquhouns were defeated with 104 Colquhoun men slain. Widows of the slain men appeared before King James VI with 100 bloody shirts belonging to their deceased husbands and demanding justice for the MacGregors' bloody attack. King James VI was moved by the women's demonstration and outlawed the whole MacGregor clan. Lord Alistair MacGregor was executed along with 11 of his chieftains. This was the same King James VI who became 6 James I shortly after taking this action. The MacGregors also set fire to many homes, stole 600 cattle, 800 sheep and goats, 280 horses, and for civil compensation, the courts awarded Chief Alexander 62,000 Scottish pounds. It was not until 1774 that MacGregor's rights were finally restored and they could resume the use of their name. Now I'm jumping to 10th great-grandfather Adam Colquhoun and 10th great-grandmother Lady Kristen Lindsay. 10th great-grandfather Adam Colquhoun acquired land in Northern Ireland but never moved there. Lady Kristen died in 1629, leaving Adam with 2 young children, 9th great-grandfather Sir Robert Colquhoun and his younger sister. Adam was in ill health, so he arranged for his sister Nancy and her husband John McAllison to take his small children and raise them with their own on his property in Northern Ireland. Robert was only 8 years old when he inherited the Colquhoun land grant in Northern Ireland after Adam died. Therefore, he became the first of our pedigree Colquhoun ancestors to immigrate to Donegal, Northern Ireland. 9th great-grandmother, Father Robert married first cousin, 9th great-grandmother Catherine McAlliston in 1641. 8th great-grandfather William Calhoun was born in Donegal, Northern Ireland in 1643. William inherited a 1,500-acre Crosh House estate in Tyrone County, Ireland, from a Stuart relative. The terms of inheritance called for him to live and occupy the estate. William grew up at Croxhash and wrote a requirement in his will for all future owners of the estate must bear the name Calhoun. Calhoun is the Irish spelling of Colquhoun. William was the first to adopt the Irish spelling Calhoun. He married first cousin, 8th great-grandmother Catherine McAlliston in 1661. 7th great-grandfather Alexander Calhoun was born in Crosshask, Tyrone, Northern Ireland in 1663. Alexander entered Trinity College at the age of 17 and graduated in 1684. He became a minister in Armagh, Northern Ireland, and he married Judith Hamilton there before 1705. 6th great-grandmother Alice Calhoun was born in Tyrone, Northern Ireland in 1705. She married 6th great-grandfather Robert Armstrong in Antrim, Northern Ireland before 1733. Robert, Alice, and their family immigrated to Pennsylvania in 1735. They moved on to Augusta County, Virginia in 1738.
Alice died there in 1753, and after Alice died, Robert moved to Abbeville, South Carolina.
Now I'm going forward in time from sixth great-grandmother Alice Calhoun and looking at her non-pedigree descendants, who are also very interesting. However, before I do that, I need to tell you about the Long Cane Creek Massacre, which had a major effect on our American Calhoun ancestors. Before the French-Indian War, the Cherokee had been useful to the British colonists in preventing South Carolina lands from becoming under French control. However, after the French were driven out during the French-Indian War, the Scots-Irish started moving in the area in large numbers. The Cherokee were incensed by the continued increase in the numbers of settlers in the region and had been striking at isolated farms, stealing and slaying anyone in their way. 150 Scotch-Irish settlers in the Long Cane Creek area decided to band together and leave with most of their possessions in wagons for the safety of Fort Moore, about 60 miles southeast on the Savannah River near Augusta, Georgia. On February 1st, 1760, a few hours after setting off, they were attacked by about 100 Cherokee on horseback while they were forging a river in their wagons. Of the 150 settlers, there may have been fewer than 75 adults and perhaps 40 male defenders who might have put up a good defense, but unfortunately, their guns were packed away in the wagons. A few did recover their guns and fought the Indians for about a half an hour before retreating. Apparently, 21 Cherokee were killed or wounded in the attack, including the Cherokee chief. In the actions, the settlers lost 7 wagons. 56 of their people were killed or taken, including women and children. The rest got safely to Fort Moore. Many children were found wandering in the woods near the area the day after the attack. One man brought 9 of them to Fort Moore, some of them terribly cut with tomahawks and left for dead, and others scalped, yet still alive.
The Greenwood County, South Carolina newspaper, the Index Journal, 31 December 2000, published this article about the Long Cane Creek Massacre with lots of good information. I've enlarged pieces of the newspaper article that pertain to the Calhoun family to make them easier to read. You can stop the video and read them if you're interested. They were very good references, but I will talk about their stories of the Calhouns in more detail below. This is a map of South Carolina prior to 1785. It shows the important landmarks for the story of the Long Cane Creek Massacre. Long Cane Creek flows from the Cherokee Nation to the Savannah River through the 96th district of the South Carolina colony. The Long Cane settlement is shown next to Long Cane Creek. Fort Moore is where our ancestors who survived the Long Cane Creek Massacre took refuge. Long Cane Creek got its name from the exceptionally tall cane brakes in the area.
Do you know what a cane brake is? I didn't, but it becomes an important part of our story. Cane brakes were large tracts of giant cane plants, an evergreen relative of bamboo, which once grew across the great stretches of the Carolinas and the southeast, usually along rivers and streams. In fertile soil, the cane plant can reach a height of nearly 20 feet. Often it multiplies in thick patches with an extensive network of roots that can crowd out nearly any other form of vegetation. This is the extended Calhoun family tree showing sixth great-grandmother Alice Calhoun's descendants. I believe the story how they were affected by the Long Cane Creek Massacre will provide a good example of the character of our Scotch-Irish ancestors and the challenges they faced on the American frontier. Our pedigree ancestors are in the yellow boxes on the right. I discussed 7th great-grandfather Alexander Calhoun and 7th great-grandmother Judith Hamilton and their daughter 6th great-grandmother Alice Calhoun a couple of charts back. 6th great-grand-uncle James Calhoun and 6th great-grandaunt Catherine Montgomery were our first Calhoun ancestors to arrive in America in 1733. They settled in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and were followed by 6th great-grandmother Alice Calhoun and Robert Armstrong in 1735. James Calhoun died in Pennsylvania in 1741. After he died, 6th great-grandmother Catherine Montgomery Calhoun became the matriarch of the Scotch-Irish clan in America. She moved the clan to South Carolina in the 1750s to take advantage of the free land available there. They chose to settle along Long Cane Creek area, which got its name because of the particularly tall cane brakes there. The height of the wild canebrakes indicated that the soil was particularly fertile, which attracted the settlers to the area. The Cherokee also considered the fertile land to be legally their territory and attacked the settlement on February 1st, 1760. This was known as the Long Cane Creek Massacre, which I described in the charts above. 76-year-old Catherine Montgomery in the red box at the top was killed in the massacre. Her oldest son, James Jr., and her youngest son, John, in the red boxes were also killed. James Jr. was the commander of the Long Cane Creek settlement. Her other three sons survived the attack. Catherine's youngest son, Patrick, in the dashed red box, survived the massacre but was killed in 1795 while pursuing the Cherokee that had attacked his family during the massacre. Her third oldest son, William, survived the massacre, but William's three daughters were either killed or kidnapped. 7-year-old Catherine and 4-year-old Mary were killed. 5-year-old Anne, in the blue box, was kidnapped and held for ransom for 14 years, after which she was released and returned to Long Cane Creek and married and raised a family. After seeing his daughters attacked, William unhitched a horse from a wagon and loaded his pregnant wife Agnes and their youngest son Joseph and told them to escape to Fort Moore. Agnes and Joseph didn't make it to the fort that night, but found a deserted cabin and some food. The next morning, they saddled up and rode on to the fort. William was able to get to Fort Moore a few days later. William and Agnes' son, Patrick III, is also shown in the green box, was born in Fort Monroe 3 weeks later. Catherine's second eldest son, Ezekiel, 15-year-old daughter, Rebecca, in the green box, escaped by hiding in the canebrakes during the attack and was reunited with her family a few days later. 5 years later, she married a Revolutionary War hero, General Andrew Pickens. She was the mother of Andrew Pickens, Jr. and grandmother of Francis Pickens, both who were governors of South Carolina. All the surviving Calhouns returned to the Long Cane Creek settlement after the massacre. Notice that none of our Panther ancestors were affected by the massacre. Also notice that John C. Calhoun in Florida by now in the magenta box on the third row on the right. John was the son of Patrick Calhoun, Jr. He married his first cousin, one times removed, Florida Bonal Calhoun, daughter of John's cousin, John Ewing Calhoun in Florida Bonal. I'll have more to say about them a little later.
So who was John C. Calhoun? John C. Calhoun was sixth great granddad Catherine Calhoun's grandson and my fifth cousin 2 times removed. On 13 October 1807, he was elected to the South Carolina House of Representatives. On 8th of October 1817, he left Congress to become the Secretary of War under President James Monroe. Then he was Vice President to John Quincy Adams in 1824, and then became Vice President to fellow Scots-Irishman Andrew Jackson in 1828. On January 4th of 1833, he began his term as Senator from South Carolina and was reelected to 1834 and 1840 and served until March 1843 when he was appointed Secretary of State by President John Tyler. On November 26, 1845, he was again elected to the Senate where he served until his death. So what was the aftermath of the Long Cane Creek Massacre? The plaque on the left commemorates the victims who were buried in the mass grave at the site of the Long Cane Creek Massacre. Sixth great-grandmother Catherine Montgomery's tombstone is on the right. She was 76 years old when she was killed. By 1763, our surviving Calhoun ancestors moved back to their homes in the Long Cane Creek settlement. To resettle the backcountry, the General Assembly of South Carolina passed the Boundary Act of July 25, 1761. It provided generous head rights of 100 acres for the head of a household and for single individuals over the age of 16, and 50 acres each for each woman, child, which was to be owned by the head of the household. It encouraged significant immigration to South Carolina, with Charleston becoming the major port of entry for Scotch-Irish coming from Ulster. The boundary land consisted of 20,500 acres near the headwaters of Long Cane Creek. This attracted our last wave of Scotch-Irish ancestors who arrived in the area starting in 1767. So whatever happened to the Colquhoun clan? Well, actually, the Colquhoun clan still exists. Malcolm Colquhoun, as seen in the picture on the right, is the current Colquhoun clan chief. In 2012, he opened the Loch Lomond Arms Hotel in Luss, where we can all book rooms and visit our ancestor home like we did in Harpo. They have annual gatherings around the world, including right here at Stone Mountain. You can get information on the website below. Now I'm moving on to the Armstrong clan. The Armstrong clan are generally recognized as being descended from Celtic Welsh-speaking families who lived in the tribal way of life along the Scottish and English border for many generations. The pictures here are the Armstrong family crest on the left, the Armstrong tartan in the center, and the Armstrong coat of arms to the right. According to the legend, the Armstrong family derives its name from the following circumstances. A horse of an ancient Scottish king was killed under him in battle. His armor-bearer immediately grasped the king by the thigh and set him on another horse so he could continue the fight. For the assistance in such a critical moment, the king rewarded him the lands on the border between Scotland and England. The king also gave him the name Armstrong and assigned him a family crest of an arm grasping a leg of armor. The Latin phrase on the crest, Invictus Manio, is translated from Latin as I remain unvanquished. The Armstrong family coat of arms has a chevron with 3 arms wearing armor. Again, I was lucky to find several good references that help me tell the story of our Armstrong clan's ancestors. 2 books, Noble Southern Families by Zelda Armstrong and Chronicles of the Armstrongs by James Armstrong were a big help. The web links to the right contain lots of details about the Armstrong ancestors as well. Due to the excellent references, I can trace our pedigree Armstrong tree back for 21 generations. This is the Armstrong pedigree tree, starting with 6th great-grandfather Robert Armstrong and ending with 18th great-grandfather Alexander Armstrong, who was born in 1250. It's the same as Alice Calhoun's tree that I showed earlier for the first 8 generations, so I'm not going to repeat that. I know it's hard to read, but I'll repeat the blown-up parts on the charts below. The dashed yellow lines separate our Armstrong ancestors into 4 groups starting on the right. The first group of 8 generations of Armstrongs lived and died in Scotland. The second group of 2 generations immigrated from Scotland to Northern Ireland. The next 2 generations lived and died in Northern Ireland, and the last group, consisting of Robert Armstrong and Alice Calhoun, immigrated to the British American colonies in 1738. This is the tree for the first 6 generations of pedigree Armstrong ancestors. They were all lairds of Manderton Castle, as shown in the table. 7th laird of Manderton Castle, Thomas Armstrong, is not shown in the pedigree tree because he was our 12th great-uncle, not our 12th great-grandfather. I'm not going to talk about every one of them, but I'll highlight some of the more interesting ones. They were not very creative in naming their children. 4 of the first Armstrongs in the tree were named Alexander. Alexander II is the first one that I can identify, so his father must have been Alexander too. I'll start with 18th great-grandfather Alexander Armstrong II, who was born in 1250 in Dunbartonshire. He was the first laird of Manderton Castle and the clan chief. Alexander's son, Alexander III, was the 2nd laird of Manderton Castle. He was born in the castle in 1285, but was imprisoned and killed by conspirator William de Solis at Hermitage Castle. So what was Manderton Castle? Manderton Castle was built around 1135 by the Armstrong clan. The picture on the left is what remains of Manderton Castle that was the home of the lairds of the Armstrong clan for 300 years. It's situated on the Little River in Dunbartonshire, Scotland. The map on the right, you can see that the castle was next to the borders between Scotland and England. The debatable lands had been fought over between Scotland and England since Roman times. It was not until 1237 that the border between Scotland and England was settled by a treaty, and then as late as the 17th century, the debatable lands where the Armstrongs lived were frequently hotly contested. The Armstrong at times would act quite independently of the Scottish kings, or anyone else for that matter. They were the most turbulent, powerful, and feared of all border clans, being able to quickly muster 3,000 horsemen when needed. Theirs was an inevitable task of defending a large portion of the border against English incursions, which they did well when their own kings were not executing their chiefs. By the late 1200s, 18th great-grandfather Alexander Armstrong II became the first laird of Manderton Castle,
and leader of the Armstrong clan. Alexander Armstrong's son, 17th great-grandfather Alexander Armstrong III, was the second laird of Manderton Castle. He was born in the castle in 1285 and was imprisoned and killed by William de Soulis at Hermitage Castle. The Melholm Cross was erected on the grounds of the Manderton Castle in his memory. He is possibly even buried beneath it. The cross was one of the Armstrong clan's most ancient and valued relics. The Melholm Cross is a little over 8 feet high. The carving is worn but has distinctive symbols of the Armstrong clan: a bent arm from the family crest and the chevron bent of arms on the family coat of arms. I can't find out for sure where the name Melholm came from, but there was a town called Melholm nearby at one time. This is a picture of Hermitage Castle. So what is its story? Well, it played an important part in the story of 17th great-grandfather Alexander Armstrong because he was murdered there. Hermitage Castle was supposedly built by Nicholas de Soulis around 1240. It stayed in his family until approximately 1320, when his descendant, William de Soulis, was implicated in the disappearance of numerous children and had attempted to assassinate King Robert de Bruce. He also had a reputation for practicing witchcraft. William de Soulis was captured by Chief Alexander's men, but not knowing de Soulis' reputation, Alexander ordered them to be released. To show his gratitude, de Soulis invited Chief Alexander and his men to Hermitage Castle to attend a banquet. However, when they got to the Hermitage Castle, Alexander and his men were murdered. De Soulis was recaptured and executed. Hermitage Castle eventually even ended up in the hands of the Armstrong for a brief period of time. Standing solely with few windows on an open moor, even in ruins, it's one of the most starkly brooding edifices to be found anywhere in Scotland. The castle is said to be haunted by victims of Lord de Soulis, and in fact has a reputation as one of the most haunted castles in Great Britain. There have been sightings of figures in the upper windows that are impossible to access today, and mysterious sounds coming from the castle when there's no one present. Hermitage Castle now is cared for by the Historic Environment of Scotland, an executive agency of the Scottish Government, and is open to visitors from the 1st of April to the 31st of October each year. I'm skipping to 13th great-grandfather Alexander Armstrong, who was the 6th and last pedigree ancestor who was a laird at Manderton Castle. 13th great-grandfather Alexander's son, 12th great-grandfather uncle Thomas Armstrong, was the 7th laird of Manderton Castle. However, Thomas's brother, 12th great-grandfather Johnny Armstrong, was the most interesting of all of our ancestors. Johnny was an infamous outlaw who led many border raids against the English. The statue is on the left, and the memorial on the right marks the spot where he was hanged by King James V in 1530. 12th great-grandfather Johnny Armstrong was not 13th great-grandfather Alexander Armstrong's oldest son, so he did not become the 7th laird of Manderton Castle. Therefore, Johnny built Gilnockie Castle in 1518. The painting on the left is a picture of Johnny on his horse in front of Gilnockie Castle. The picture on the right is the restored Gilnockie Castle Tower today. The Armstrong clan, led by Johnny, became a national menace to England. Thomas Darkey, the warden of the Western English marshes, destroyed Gilnockie Castle in 1523, but Johnny had it rebuilt. Johnny and his clan struck back with raids and ambushes along the border. In 1525, the Earl of Angus, regent of Scotland, descended upon Lindendale, home of many of the Scottish Armstrong clans, and murdered Johnny's brother, 12th great-granduncle Simon Armstrong, and took some 4,000 cattle. Soon after Angus left Lindendale, 400 Armstrong clan riders, led by Johnny, swept into England, where they killed many English settlers living along the border, burned houses, and took 55 horses and men captive. 2 weeks later, even more horsemen descended on the English garrison town of Tithdale, where they took prisoners' horses and left many dead behind them. Johnny Armstrong could put 3,000 men in the saddle and probably did more damage than any other two families combined, both in Scotland and England. In 1527, the Earl of Angus made another foray into Lindendale. He slew a score of Armstrongs and captured another 24. 13 of these prisoners were hung on a bridge, while the remaining 11 were taken to Edinburgh as hostages in hopes that the raids would stop. When this failed to have any effect, the 11 Armstrong men were also hung. Armstrong raids continued into England. In 1527, Johnny Armstrong led a daring raid which freed some of his kinsmen and other outlaws imprisoned in Newcastle. The English warden, Lord Darcy, retaliated in 1528 by burning the Glenalky Castle again. In revenge, Armstrong burned Netherley Hall in the Debatable Lands. So whatever happened to Johnny Armstrong? In the summer of 1528, young King James V took the throne of Scotland. James desired peace along the border and recognized that the Armstrongs was a force that he needed to subdue. In June and July of 1530, James V led 10,000 men to Lindendale and captured the Armstrong clan. Johnny, his brother, 7th Laird Thomas, and 36 unarmed members of the clan accepted an invitation to visit the king. You'd think by now the Armstrongs would quit falling for the invitation to White Castle trick. However, the king promised Johnny safe conduct, and when Johnny arrived, he was hanged by King James along with 36 of his men. 11th great-grandfather Christopher Armstrong, Johnny's son, was surprisingly pardoned by King James V and continued to live in the rebuilt Glenalky Castle. The Armstrongs, being more loyal to the clan than Scotland, avenged the hanging of Johnny Armstrong by refusing to join the Scottish army. Some actually even joined the English army. Armstrongs continued their raids for the next 80 years, and a popular ballad, the Ballad of Johnny Armstrong, was composed about Johnny's exploits and his death. You can hear Scotch-Irishman Michael Martin Murphy sing the Ballad of Johnny Armstrong at the YouTube link on the right. And the words are on the left, but they're hard to read, but you can also read them on the link to the left. I've added a table of the last 4 Armstrong lairds of Malderton Castle who were not pedigree ancestors but cousins. Archibald Armstrong, 8th Laird of Malderton Castle, was an enemy of Lord Bothwell, Mary Queen of Scots' husband. In 1569, Lord Bothwell spent a night at Malderton Castle and then ordered it blown up the next morning. After his death in 1570, the Armstrongs took a more patriotic stance and devastated the English side of the border, alleged to avenge the imprisonment of Queen Mary of Scots. 9th Laird of Malderton Castle, Simon Armstrong, rebuilt Malderton Castle in 1583, but was captured by the English and treacherously killed. His successor, 10th Great Laird of Malderton Castle, Archibald Armstrong, was destined to be the last Laird of the Armstrong clan. Well, what happened to the Armstrong clan in Scotland? Queen Elizabeth I of England died in 1603, and James VI of Scotland became King James I of England, Wales, Ireland, and Scotland. After King James was coronated, one of his highest priorities was the suppression of the Scottish border families like the Armstrongs. He was afraid that their borders incursions would make him unpopular with his new English subjects. King James I established powerful landlords in the Debatable Lands and ordered them to put to death all Scottish raiders within 2 miles of the border, which would include the Armstrongs. Archibald remained the Armstrong laird until 1610, when he and 24 of his followers were charged with plundering the English enemy's property. Shortly after, Archibald was executed and his lands were confiscated. The remaining Armstrong rebels were tortured and hung at the Market Cross in Edinburgh. This brought an end to the Armstrong clan in Scotland. With their leaders executed, their lands confiscated, and the entire clan outlawed, the surviving Armstrongs largely fled the region. Many of the exiled Scottish rebels became the Scots-Irish of Northern Ireland. 10th great-grandfather Colonel William Armstrong, called Christie's Will, was born in Glenalky Castle in Dumfriesshire, Scotland, in 1565. He married 10th great-grandmother Margaret Elliot there in 1596. 9th great-grandfather Thomas Armstrong was born there in 1603. Christie's Will moved to Fermanagh County, Northern Ireland, in 1604. And Christie decided it was better to join the English instead of continually fighting them. He joined the army of King Charles I in Northern Ireland that was fighting Oliver Cromwell's army that was invading the island at the time. He died in battle in 1649 at Brookborough, Fermanagh County, Ulster, Northern Ireland. Upon Christie's Will's death, 9th great-grandfather Thomas Armstrong was awarded the land grant in Fermanagh County, Northern Ireland. 9th great-grandfather Thomas Armstrong married Anne Anderson, Northern Ireland, in 1623. He sat in the Irish Parliament in 1647 and had a land grant in County Dublin but was back in England fighting in the 1650s, participating in royalist conspiracies against Oliver Cromwell, and being twice imprisoned in the Tower of London. When King Charles came to the throne in 1660, Thomas returned to Northern Ireland and resumed his post in the Irish militia until his death in 1662. Eighth great-grandfather William Armstrong was born in County Fermanagh, Northern Ireland in 1635. In August of 1649, Oliver Cromwell landed in Ireland with his Puritan army. In 1650, after Christy Will was killed, Cromwellian soldiers took control of the Armstrong home in Northern Ireland, and William Armstrong had to leave. William Armstrong married eighth great-grandmother Catherine Baird in 1653. And seventh great-grandfather John Armstrong was born in County Fermanagh in 1657. When Charles II was put in power in 1660, eighth great-grandfather Captain William Armstrong was granted Farney Castle and the adjacent lands to tribute to his father's support for King Charles I and to compensate the Armstrongs for their loss during the English Civil War. When seventh great-grandfather William died in 1693, seventh great-grandfather John Armstrong inherited the castle in the States. John married seventh great-grandmother Julianne Carew before 1700 in Fermanagh Castle. Sixth great-grandfather Robert Armstrong was born in the castle in 1700. Sixth great-grandfather Robert Armstrong married sixth great-grandmother Alice Calhoun in Northern Ireland in 1728. This marriage united the descendants of two prominent Scottish clans in our tree, the Armstrong clan and the Calhoun clan. So what's the story of Farney Castle? The first Norman fortification at Farney Castle in Tipperary, Ireland was built in 1185. It would have consisted initially of a stout lumber structure. The present existing stone castle was completed in 1495 by Thomas Butler, 7th Earl of Ormond. The present a round tower of this magnificently restored castle stands 5 stories high. It's somewhat unusual that it is completely circular, whereas most of the types of structures constructed in Ireland were either square or oblong. The castle possessed a mural staircase, that's a stone staircase within the thickness of the walls, off of which are undiscovered secret rooms which may still exist. Farney Castle was associated with the Armstrong family for nearly 200 years. Well, before I end the Armstrong story, I'd like to introduce a couple of famous members of the Armstrong clan. I don't know exactly how we are related, but they are claimed to be members of the Armstrong clan by the Armstrong Clan Association. First, fellow Scots-Irishman and electrical engineer Edwin Armstrong. This plaque highlights his most important achievements. Edwin Armstrong is best known for inventing frequency modulation, or FM radio, in 1933. FM provided the audio signal of radio by eliminating the static caused by electrical equipment and lightning. Prior to this, amplitude modulation, or AM radio, had been extremely susceptible to such interference, and which was prompted Armstrong to investigate the problem in the first place. In addition to frequency modulation, Armstrong also was known for developing several other key innovations. Every radio or television set today makes use of one or more of his inventions. Armstrong invented the superheterodyne tuner that allows radios to be tuned to different stations. During the 1960s, NASA used FM transmission to communicate with the astronauts while they were in space. Today, FM technology is still used throughout the world for most forms of audio and TV broadcasting. Another famous Scotch-Irishman is astronaut Neil Armstrong, the first man to walk on the moon on July 21st, 1969. He communicated back to Earth using FM communication system invented by Edwin Armstrong. Neil Armstrong left a piece of the Armstrong tartan fabric on the moon to attest forever that Clan Armstrong is still exploring the most distant frontiers. In March of 1972, Neil Armstrong made a pilgrimage to Ganaki Tower, the home of 12th great-grandfather Johnny Armstrong. This is a picture of him on top of the Ganaki Tower. He ascended the spiral staircase and looked out across the borderlands between Scotland and England from the walkway that encircled the tower, just as early Armstrongs had done in the troubled times along the border. At the time of his visit, the Ganaki Castle was abandoned ruin, and the roof had gone, and the interior floors had collapsed. Today, Ganaki Castle has been repaired, and it has a visitor center welcoming people from all over the world. The walkway has been secured, so once more visitors can stand where both 12th great-grandfather Johnny Armstrong and Neil Armstrong stood surveying the Scottish border. Well, whatever happened to the Armstrong clan? Remember, the Armstrong clan was destroyed by King James I in 1610. However, the Armstrong clan was revived by Ted and Judy Armstrong on the 21st of July, 1969, the night that Neil Armstrong landed on the moon, when they created the Armstrong Clan Association. The objectives of this association were to produce former Armstrong land and towers on the Scottish border, including Ganaki Tower and the Mandragon Tower, and restore them the most suitable way they could as focal points for the clan members for all over the world. The associated researchers hold extensive genealogical records and primary sources and help members discover their Armstrong roots. They have an active Armstrong DNA research project and cooperate with genetic specialists and historic researchers to develop a deeper understanding of the clan's origins. A regular newsletter keeps members updated, featuring clan news and stories from around the world. I'd like to make a couple of closing comments about the two Scottish clans we just talked about before moving on. They were more prosperous than our other Scots-Irish ancestors, who tended to be tradespeople, farmers, or ministers. And they had several things in common. They had long histories, both were powerful with castles, lots of land, many loyal clan members, and they both maintained their power for a very long time. They both had to do a lot of fighting to survive. Our branches of both clans immigrated to Northern Ireland in the 1600s and to America in the 1700s. They both settled in the backcountry of Virginia and South Carolina, as far away from the British colonial government authorities as possible. When they got to America, they both immediately were fighting Indians along the frontier. However, they have quite different enemies. The Callicans lived far from the English border between Scotland and Highlands and Lowlands. Most of their troubles were feuding with neighboring clans. They had relatively good relationships with the kings and the Scottish government. They were even held government offices from time to time. The Armstrongs lived in the contested border region between Scotland and England. Most of their troubles were with both English and Scottish kings. They were loyal to the clan and switched their allegiance between kings and countries when it was their best interest of the clan to do so. Their clan was eventually destroyed by King James I. However, they moved to Ireland. They had good relations with the English kings and queens. By getting a rare look into the backgrounds of these two branches of our Scottish-Irish tree, we can see how the clan experience shaped their behavior and loyalties when they came to America. You remember that sixth great-grandfather Robert Armstrong and sixth great-grandmother Alice Calhoun were married in Ulster just before they came to America. They combined the two clans together. I think this is a fitting way to end the story of the Armstrongs and the Calhouns. Do we have any more Scotch-Irish clans in our family? Yes, I think if we dug deep enough, I could find a clan for nearly all of them. However, I'm stopping with just one more, the Scottish Hanny clan, which became the Hanna clan in Ireland. They followed pretty much the same path as the Calhouns and the Armstrongs, so I'm not going to go to cover them in as much detail. They come out of the Mobley branch of my mother's tree. I've separated them where they live with the yellow lines, just like before. But look at the magenta lines. These ancestors are MacGregors, the clan that fought the Callican clan ancestors in the Battle of Glenfruin. It would be interesting to explore this a little bit further, but I'm forcing myself to move on after just one more chart. I do have to answer a few basic questions about the Hanna clan. Where did they live? The map shows that they lived along the English border like the Armstrongs. Did they have a castle? Sorby Castle, shown in the picture on the left, was the headquarters for their lairs. What did their family crest, coat of arms, and tartan look like? They are shown in the charts. The motto is, though through hardship to the highest places of enlightenment. The animal on the coat of arms are 3 roebucks, and they do have an active clan society shown at the bottom of the chart. I have one more Scotch-Irish family group to talk about who arrived in the Long Cane Creek area just after the Long Cane Creek Massacre of 1760. The increasing number of Scotch-Irish settlers from Ulster were attracted by an offer of free land authorized by the Bounty Act of 1761 and to escape religious persecution and excessive rents in Northern Ireland. Some 62 ships sailed from Ulster ports, arriving in Charleston between 1760 and 1775. Several immigrations included entire Presbyterian congregations from Ulster and accompanied by their pastors. Two are particularly relevant to our ancestor story. The first occurred in 1764 when a group of 300 Cedar or Associate Presbyterians families arrived from Ulster under the leadership of their pastor, Reverend Thomas Clark, to New York in July of 1764. The second group arrived from Ulster to South Carolina in 1772 when the members of the Reverend William Martin's congregation of Covenanters, the Reformed Presbyterians, sailed to Charleston between August 25th and August 27th of 1772. The Associated and Reformed Presbyterians were Presbyterians group that spun off from the Presbyterian Church of Scotland because of theological differences. One of these families was our Presley ancestors. Unlike the Armstrongs, Calhouns, and Hannas, I was unable to identify an ancient Presley Scottish clan going back many generations. However, I was very fortunate to find a book, Settling of South Carolina Backcountry by Nancy Presley. It's about our fifth great-grandfather, David Presley, and his brother, fifth great-granduncle John Presley, and their extended families. It describes their life in Scotland, their time in Northern Ireland, and their immigration to South Carolina after the Long Cane Creek Massacre. You might note that the author of the book, Nancy Presley, spells her name without the second E. In her research, she found 11 variations of the spelling of Presley shown in the yellow box. Most of our other references I have found use the Presley with the second E spelling, and that's the way I will do from now on as well. Nancy Presley's book gives me a rare opportunity to provide more detail about the Presley's experience in Scotland, Ulster, and South Carolina. The Presleys settled in Abbeville district of South Carolina. They come out of my mother's second great-grandmother, Jane Presley's branch of our tree. You can see that we have 8 pedigree Scotch-Irish immigrant ancestors in the orange boxes and 2 born in Abbeville in the magenta boxes. This is fifth great-grandfather David Presley's family branch of the tree. Our pedigree ancestors are in the yellow boxes. Fifth great-granduncle John Presley was David Presley's brother. John immigrated to join his brother in Long Cane Creek in 1772. Everyone shown in this tree lived in Long Cane Creek area of Abbeville district of South Carolina. Thanks to Nancy Presley's book, this is one of the few examples I have of the Scotch-Irish family that moved from Scotland to Northern Ireland and on to South Carolina in one generation. Fifth great-grandfather David Presley was born in Glasgow, Scotland in 1730. He married fifth great-grandmother Esther Brown there in 1749, and fourth great-grandfather Sam Presley was born there in 1756. The family moved to Belfast, Northern Ireland in 1762. They sailed to America from Belfast, Northern Ireland on Christmas Eve, 1766, on the Earl of Hillsborough. They settled in the Abbeville district of South Carolina a short time later. The map on the left is of the Glasgow, Scotland area. The earliest known verifiable records about the Presley family prior to their arrival in South Carolina are parish christening records from 2 villages near Glasgow. David's eldest son, Samuel Presley, was christened in 1756 in Ayr, near the coast of Scotland. In 1757, David Presley is listed in the census records in the town of Lochbonnock, Scotland, as a weaver. Lochbonnock was a well-known weaving center. Lochbonnock, where David lived, was small and centered around the gates of the chapel of Lochbonnock, which was built in 1729. Today, little more than a clock tower stands at this church. It was known as Old Simon, which was part of the Church of Scotland. A typical weaver's college of the period consisted of 2 rooms for living and a 3rd room for the loom. David and his family left Scotland for Ulster sometime after October of 1762, and on Christmas Eve they arrived from Belfast to Charleston, South Carolina. They moved up to Hard Labor Creek in the Abbeville area. Because the South Carolina Boundary Act was meant to attract new immigrants, sailing only required a certificate of recommendation from the passenger's minister and two church elders stating that he was a Protestant in good behavior. People were allowed to bring one trunk for free. Conditions on ships varied depending on the experience and benevolence of the captain and the amount of cargo he was carrying. Most passengers suffered long, cramped voyages in poorly ventilated surroundings. The sea voyage usually lasted 7 to 9 weeks. Many families forged friendships during their journey that helped them become communities after they arrived in America. This is a drawing of Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, about the time David's family arrived. Charleston was one of the 4 largest cities in the colonies, along with Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. According to South Carolina Council records, David was accompanied by Esther Presley, age 36, Samuel Presley, age 11, David Presley Jr., age 6, and Agnes Presley, age 4. On February 27, 1767, David petitioned for 350 acres of land on the branch of the western fork of the Hard Labor Creek. David and his family probably stayed in Charleston until at least May of 1767, when he would have had to appear in person, as was required to have his survey certified under the Bounty Act. His plat was formally granted in September of 1767. The family would have been given basic supplies to begin farming and probably a 20-shilling bounty. How did David and his family get to the Long Cane Creek area? They would have traveled into the backcountry, probably on the newly opened Charleston to Fort Charlotte road shown in red, which is connect the old Cherokee path shown in gray. They would then take the old Cherokee path a short distance from Fort Charlotte to the Long Cane Creek area. The trip would have taken at least 10 days. The fact that David received 350 acres, 100 for the head of the household and 50 for spouse and dependents under 16, suggested that there was another child with him, possibly yet an unnamed or unbaptized child born on the journey, or a child underage of 16 in their care. After he arrived, David continued to acquire land, petitioning in 1772 for additional 150 acres, possibly for his son Samuel, who would have been 16 years of age at the time. Then on September 1st of 1772, he petitioned for 150 acres based on an April 15th survey, which was immediately adjacent to his bounty plot. David later bequested the lands to his son David Presley Jr. David's older brother, fifth great-grandfather John Presley, arrived from Ulster in 1772 and settled next to David. This map shows the South Carolina districts in 1767 when David Presley settled in the 96th district. The district was further divided to include the Abbeville district in 1785. You can also say the Camden district, where our early South Carolina ancestors settled, was split into the Camden and Georgetown districts by this time. Like most settlers, the first task for David and John would have been to cut down trees, build their homes, and cultivate their fields to grow subsistence crops. They would have cut down to build the trees to build a house and leave the stumps in place. They would have received help from their other family members and their neighbors. A typical home would have been a 1 to 1.5 story log structure elevated off the ground with pieces of stone. Clay and straw chinking placed between the logs would have sealed the cabin. Children would have probably slept on straw mattresses in the half-story upper loft, and the bed on the ground floor, along with the table, would have been the central pieces of furniture for the house. Houses generally had front and back doors, sometimes partitions divided the downstairs, and many early cabins did not have windows. Fifth great-grandfather Robert Thompson was born in County Down, Northern Ireland in 1725. He moved to Cork, Ireland, and married Mary Doris there in 1743. Robert and Doris moved to Ulster, Northern Ireland in 1752. Fourth great-grandmother Elizabeth Thompson was born in Ulster in 1758. The family moved to the part of 96th District in 1661 after the Long Cane Creek Massacre. Fifth great-grandfather Robert Thompson was a blacksmith. He died in Abbeville in 1772. Elizabeth Thompson married Samuel Presley in Abbeville in 1774. Fifth great-grandmother Mary Doris died there in 1779. And fourth great-grandmother Elizabeth died in Abbeville in 1798. The Clarks come out of the Mann branch of our tree through Robert Clinton Mann's wife, second great-grandmother Jane Presley. I mentioned above that Reverend Thomas Clark brought his congregation of over 300 Scotch-Irish Presbyterians to America. Reverend Thomas Clark was our fifth great-grandfather. Fifth great-grandfather Thomas Clark was born in Paisley, Northern Ireland in 1720. He moved to Armagh, Northern Ireland in 1752, and he married Elizabeth Nesbit there in 1752. Fourth great-grandfather Benjamin Clark was born in Callans, Monaghan, Northern Ireland in 1759. Elizabeth died there in 1762. Third great-grandmother Elizabeth Clark was born in Abbeville, South Carolina in 1780. She married third great-grandfather Robert Presley there in 1809. Fifth great-grandfather Reverend Dr. Thomas Clark was the most interesting ancestor in this part of our tree. He was educated at the University of Glasgow, completing his ministerial studies in 1748. This was his second degree, having earlier received a degree as a medical doctor. In between degrees, Clark was also a soldier who battled against Bonnie Prince Charlie, the grandson of King James II of England, who had led an army to put a Catholic back on the throne in Great Britain in 1745. In 1751, he was a pastor for the Associated Presbyterian Congregation in Ballybay, Northern Ireland, which was made up almost exclusively of Scottish immigrants. The map on the left is Northern Ireland with the county of Monaghan in the red oval. The map on the right is the Ballybay area where Reverend Clark's congregation lived. The picture in the middle is of Reverend Clark's Callaghan's Presbyterian Church. The Associated Presbyterians split off from the Church of Scotland. They split because the citizens were required to take an oath before holding public office, which included a statement about upholding the true religion, which meant the Church of Scotland. Reverend Clark had very strong beliefs and made enemies within the Church of Scotland, but at the same time he attracted many new followers who agreed with his religious views. His pamphlet, Remarks upon the Manner and Form of Swearing by Touching and Kissing the Gospels, led first to a fine in 1752 and then prison in 1754. In 1754, Clark was jailed for refusing to take an oath refuting his beliefs. Once arrested, he stayed in jail for 10 weeks awaiting trial, only to have the judge find the warrant defective, and he was released. Less than a month later, however, he was re-jailed after a new warrant was obtained. When or how he was released the second time is not recorded, but he was in jail for several months. Clark proudly proclaimed that while he was in prison, he never missed a Sunday service. His congregation gathered outside the window of his prison cell to hear him preach, which further irritated the fundamentalist Church of Scotland Presbyterians. While Reverend Clark was in prison, he began to think about coming to the New World. And by 1763, he had made inquiries and received letters and a call from two congregations, one in Rhode Island and the other one in Albany, New York. When he announced that he would be leaving for New York, his entire congregation said they would follow him. Reverend Clark and his congregation departed on the ship John from Ballybay. This mass migration is known as the Callaghan's Exodus. His congregation, which then included over 300 men, women, and children, left with Clark in Northern Ireland on May 10th, 1764, and arrived in New York on July 28th. This was the first known instance of an entire Presbyterian congregation making the journey to the New World as a unit. And as another first, Clark established a church, which is now in Salem, New York, because it was the only Associated Presbyterian minister in America. In the spring of 1765, seeking a permanent home for his congregation, Clark brought 1,250-acre tract of land. The patent was divided into 308 lots of about 40 acres, plus a large reserve for a common area, and 3 lots set apart for the use of the preacher, the school, and the schoolmaster. The congregation traveled up the Hudson River and settled first in Stillwater, just north of Albany, where they lived for 2 years under primitive conditions while clearing the land on what Clark had purchased for his new frontier. They built houses, but first they constructed a church and a meeting house. The drawing on the right is not of the church, but likely a similar one. While still in Stillwater, yet another controversy broke out. Whether the nature was religious or secular is not clear, but the quarrelsome Presbyterians split up again. Half of Reverend Clark's congregation settled with him in New York. The rest moved south, probably along the Great Wagon Road or by ship,
eventually settling in the lower Long Cane Creek area of South Carolina backcountry, where presumably they were able to take advantage of the new South Carolina Bounty Act. Members of Reverend Clark's group who moved South Carolina eventually helped form three associated Reformed Presbyterians, or APR, congregations in the area: the Little River Congregation, the Long Cane Creek Congregation, and the Cedar Creek Congregation. The Cedar Creek APR church no longer exists, but the drawing of it is shown on to the right. It was Presley's church, and it was some of the graves are still in the graveyard. Reverend Clark returned twice to the area, visit his parishioners in 1770 and again in 1789, before settling there permanently in 1782. During the 1780s, a period of enormous change and renewal, he brought a zealous belief in the preserving of the purest position with regards to orthodoxy of the Scottish traditions and nurtured the growth of the newly formed Associated Reformed Presbyterian Church in South Carolina. Reverend Clark died in Cedar Springs, South Carolina in 1792. Before talking about fifth great-grand-uncle John Presley, I need to explain how he got to South Carolina, which means I need to introduce you to Reverend William Martin. I mentioned above that Reverend William Martin brought a large group of Scotch-Irish immigrants from Northern Ireland to South Carolina. Fifth great-grandfather, or great-uncle, John Presley, was part of that group. Reverend William Martin was no shrinking violet. On top of his mammoth preaching duties and pastoral duties in Northern Ireland, he was vocal in his opposition to the high Anglican church authorities that openly discriminated against Presbyterians. Reverend Martin preached a sermon calling for his entire congregation to accompany him to South Carolina. In 1772, a total of 4,671 Ulster Presbyterians responded to Reverend Martin's call to South Carolina and left under his leadership. A total of 5 ships took these immigrants to South Carolina. One of the ships was the Freemasons, and it sailed from Northern Ireland on October 27th and arrived in Charleston in December 22. Fifth great-grandfather John Presley and his family were aboard the Freemason. This exodus was a tremendous feat at the time, and yet it goes to illustrate the determination of Reverend William Martin. Due to the excessive numbers involved, the large group that arrived with Reverend Martin was scattered throughout South Carolina. You might remember back in 1630, William Winthrop brought about 1,000 Puritans, including some of our ancestors, to the Massachusetts Bay Colony to escape religious persecution. History repeats itself for another group of our ancestors 144 years later in South Carolina. This is the passenger list for the Freemason, one of the ships in Reverend Martin's fleet. Fifth great-grandfather John Presley and his family of 5 was on the left-hand list. It shows he settled in Abbeville and was granted 300 acres under the Bounty Act, and 100 acres for him, 50 acres for his wife and his 3 children. However, the mystery is on the right-hand list. Mary Presley, who was also settled in Abbeville, is also listed. She came alone and was granted 100 acres, but who was she? I can't identify her relationship to our other Presleys. She was an adult member of Reverend Martin's congregation in Northern Ireland. This is a map from Nancy Presley's book. It shows the Presley plots in the 96th district of South Carolina before the American Revolution. You can see that Mary Presley's plot was adjacent to John Presley's plot. My guess is that she might have been John and David's sister, aunt, or first cousin. This is a map of the Long Cane Creek settlement from Nancy's book. It shows the location of the places where the Calhouns and the Presleys lived and attended church. The indices on the left and the right of the figures identify the lettered locations I have marked, and I have marked a few of them. Abbeville, the Long Cane Creek settlement where the Calhouns lived, the site of the Long Cane Creek massacre, fifth great-grandfather John Presley's plot, John Hurt's plot, Hard Labor Creek settlement where the Presleys lived, and David Presley's house. You can see that John Hurst's house and John Presley's house are right next door to each other. I'll have more to say about that in a bit. A few other points in the story are the Little River congregation, the Long Cane Creek congregation, the Cedar Creek meeting house, and the Cedar Creek church. This is fifth great uncle John Presley's family tree. He was fifth great grandfather David Presley's brother. Fifth great-grand-uncle John Presley arrived from the Long Creek settlement in 1772. And you saw that fifth great-grand-uncle John Presley and his family lived next door to John Hurst.
The reason I mention that is that John Hurst was William Randolph Hearst's second great-grandfather. You can see that the two John's children and four of his grandchildren married members of the Hearst family. They're highlighted in the magenta boxes. So who was William Randolph Hearst? In the early 20th century, William Randolph Hearst built the country's largest media empire, including the San Francisco Examiner and a movie studio. His fortunes have been estimated to be worth over $21 billion today. He built the Hearst Castle on the Pacific Coast Highway south of San Francisco, where he entertained movie stars and powerful politicians. His granddaughter, Patty Hearst, became famous after being kidnapped by the Symbionese Liberation Army, a small far-left militant protest organization, and then joined them in a bank robbery in 1974.
Well, are we related to William Randolph Hearst? There's a lot of confusing and conflicting information on the web and in marriage records. But this is what I do know. This is the family tree of John Hurst, who was William Randolph Hearst's third great-grandfather, and our fifth great-granduncle, John Presley's next-door neighbor in Abbeville. Everyone in the orange boxes in the Hearst family tree lived in Abbeville district of South Carolina, along with the Presleys for two more generations. You saw from the fifth great-grandfather, granduncle John Presley's tree, that six of our non-pedigree ancestors were married to his children or grandchildren. Two of them are shown again in the magenta boxes. Esther Presley in the blue box was William Randolph Hearst's great-grandmother. She married George Hearst, grandson of John Hurst. My problem is I can't determine how we're related to Mary Esther Presley. She's not the daughter or granddaughter of either David or John Presley. Nancy Presley stated in her book that there is some DNA and other evidence that another Presley brother or cousin was also in the area who might have been Jane Esther Presley's father. So I can't quite pin down a relationship to Randolph Hearst, but with all the marriages between the Hearst, and I'm sure that we are some type of cousins. Well, now let me summarize what I covered in this chapter. I started with a new look at our ethnic makeup. Nancy and I are about 90% Scottish, English, and Northwest European, and Welsh. The big surprise was the large amount of Scottish DNA we have. This made me dig deeper and discover our Scots-Irish heritage. I spent some time talking about the Scots-Irish ancestors. They all came to America in the 1700s from the Ulster district of Northern Ireland. The first wave came into Philadelphia in the 1740s and traveled down the Great Wagon Road to the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia and the backcountry of South Carolina, which was the last colony settled by our ancestors. The second wave came in 1760 and entered through Charleston, South Carolina, and settled in the backcountry in what would become the Abbeville district. I found that we have Scotch-Irish ancestors that we can be able to trace back to Scottish clans for 28 generations. We have reached a milestone in this chapter. Now we have talked about all the colonies where our ancestors settled. All but two of our immigrant ancestor families have now arrived in America before the American Revolution. I find it remarkable that most of our ancestors were here before the Revolution, and the last two families will not arrive until just before the Civil War. I hope you can still remember the prologue that I used to start the first part of this chapter. Well, the old professor was right. I became aware of a lot of things I didn't know about our Scotch-Irish ancestors. So I raised my level of ignorance, which raised a lot of new questions. I could do a whole chapter answering these questions. Instead, I'm forcing myself to move on to the next chapter of the American Revolution. Since most of our ancestors were in America before the Revolution, we have many Revolutionary War patriots to discuss. We also have some ancestors called Loyalists who fought with the British during the American Revolution. So stay tuned to Chapter 10.